Mary Magdalene was the first person to see the resurrected Christ. According to tradition, Mary Magdalene, a wealthy woman of importance, presented herself before Tiberius Caesar in Rome. She proclaimed the resurrection of Christ, holding an egg to illustrate her point, saying, "Christ is risen," a phrase heard to this day at Easter. Mocking her, Caesar said, "Christ is no more risen than that egg is red." Immediately, the egg turned red to prove her point. Handing out red eggs at Easter among Christians can be traced to apostolic times. The next time you see a depiction of Mary Magdalene holding a red egg, you will know the reason. I'm Sandra McDevitt for EWTN Radio.
This is an EWTN Newslink. I'm Teresa Tomeo from Catholic Connection. The former Archbishop of Los Angeles will be taking part in the rite of the closing of the coffin of Pope Francis today. Among those listed as required to take part is 89-year-old Cardinal Roger Mahony. A representative of the Holy See telling CNN he's the most senior cardinal priest available, as others are unable to participate. Being over the age of 80, Cardinal Mahony is not eligible to vote in the upcoming conclave. And authorities are accusing a man of starting what's now a massive wildfire in New Jersey. Police say 19-year-old Joseph Kling facing 1 count of arson and aggravated arson. Authorities alleging he started a bonfire Tuesday and knowingly left before the fire was properly put out. For more news with a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion on this Friday afternoon, Easter Friday if you don't mind. This program is for you if you are a non-Catholic and you've got a question or two about the Catholic faith. What in the world, what is a conclave? Questions like that, all kinds of questions we can answer on today's program. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our quickie robo response. When you get that, text us your first name and your brief question, message, and data rates may apply. You can also send us an email if you would prefer that, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Pedro Quiles, our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Rich Jesse handling social media. If you'd like to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming on both those platforms right now. All you have to do is put your question in the comments box. Rich will see it. A little light bulb will go off over his head, and he'll say, aha, it's time to copy paste and get that to those guys down there in the studio. And that's how it works. So all you have to do is, again, put that in the comments box. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
We're going to begin with a question that came in on YouTube yesterday. Couldn't get to it yesterday because we ran out of time. River says, how does an apostate or heretic Catholic, cradle Catholic, come back to the church? Let me read that again. I was a little confused on that. How does an apostate or heretic cradle Catholic come back to the church?
Go to confession.
That's it?
That's all you got to do. Go to
Wow.
confession. And I mean, if you're a Catholic, if you're a sacramentalized Catholic,
Yeah.
the church says you're Catholic, right? I mean, you don't stop being Catholic ever.
Okay.
And if you've left the church or done whatever, and I mean, people do people leave the church all the time. People do whatever all the time, and we have a way for dealing with that for baptized Catholics. It's called the sacrament of confession. You go to confession and you say, well, I did this, and this, and I'm sorry, and you get absolution, do your penance, and boom, you're back in. It's no big deal.
Fantastic.
No big deal, right? Apostasy and heresy are sins and crimes, but they can be repented of.
And that is certainly good news. River, thank you so much for your question that we received from you yesterday on YouTube. Here's a text that came in. This is from, doesn't say who it's from, but here's the question. For the first 1,500 years of the church, many heresies and sects came and went. What is different about Protestantism that has given it such staying power?
Yeah, thanks. So there actually are heresies and sects that have continued for longer than 1,500 years. From early days, and sometimes the names change, but the basic substance of the thing has remained, and merged with other trends and areas of thought and so forth. So, the Reformation had a level of institutional support, government patronage, and the like that probably was unique in the annals of church history. Among groups that have descended from Catholic unity. It became state religion in a number of European environments, and because Protestantism drew so deeply on the Catholic intellectual patrimony, it had a theoretical elaboration that was quite rigorous, and was able to embed itself in institution and ritual and culture in ways that that were more or less mainstream within their particular environments. I think all that gave it staying power, and so.
And there you go. Appreciate that. Thanks so much for that text. Here's a text from Joan who says, "I was wondering if our pets will be in heaven with us."
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the question. So, will we be in heaven with us?
Yeah.
Right, that's a norm. And what I mean by that is that the biblical vision, the Catholic vision of the future life is an embodied one, right? We confess the resurrection of the body as the ultimate destiny of the human person, and glorification of the body after the image of Christ, and the renovation of the material universe. St. Paul says all creation groans longing for the revelation of the sons of God, right? So the idea that you die, your body rots, and your soul floats up to heaven, like the little translucent Sylvester the cat from the Looney Tunes cartoons, right? That's actually not the Catholic vision of the afterlife. And we do believe in the continuing existence of the separated soul, but that's temporary, right? That's temporary until it reunites with the resurrected body at the end of time. So there will be a material universe of a sort to be occupied by the just after Christ returns. It's kind of hard for me to imagine a material universe that consists of, only humans, and then, like marble statuary, right? That seems kind of contrary to the biblical vision of the renewed heavens and the earth, in which animal and plant species seem to be anticipated, at least in the writings of the prophets when they talk about the coming kingdom of God. It does have that kind of imagery in it. Now, how much of that is literal, how much of that is figurative, impossible to know.
Okay.
Will your specific pet be there? Well, your specific pet does not have an immortal soul, right? And so there's nothing to reunite with a resurrected body, right? And so the question of personal continuity, I think, is probably not germane here. But will there be animals? Probably.
Okay. Very good. And you know what? Do we have time enough for another one? Probably not. We'll get to another email in just a moment here. If you would like to send us an email for a future show, here's the address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. We try to answer a couple of emails and texts and things during each of our live broadcasts, and then once a month or so, we'll gather up a whole bunch of emails and kind of get caught up. Again, that address, ctc@ewtn.com. But hey, we are taking your phone calls right now at 833-288-EWTN. My personal recommendation, call early in the hour so that you're not shut out and then we won't have time to get to you. You'll have to hold on to that question for the weekend. Again, 833 288-3986, or you can text the letters EWTN to 58177. Back in a moment with lots more on the Friday edition of Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Do stay with us.
This is Doug Keck, President and Chief Operating Officer of the EWTN Global Catholic Network. Are you a new listener to EWTN Radio? Welcome. We're here for you 24/7. You know, on EWTN Radio, you'll hear live and interactive shows throughout the day to answer any questions you may have about the Catholic faith. There's trustworthy news from a Catholic perspective throughout the day and evening as well. We offer a large selection of podcasts from our well-respected hosts and partners available at EWTN's Podcast Central. And of course, the daily Mass, prayers, and everything you need to edify your soul as you search for the truth. Welcome to EWTN Radio. We're blessed to have you with us.
There once was an atheist named Jim.
He doesn't look like an atheist.
Who took a church job on a whim.
I'm the waste receptacle manager.
Now that season 1 is history, it's certainly no mystery.
But you're not Catholic.
Why his atheism's out on a limb. Meet James Little. Could be the world's worst atheist. Season 2 of James the Less, coming April 29th at EWTN.com/James the Less.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Calls are coming in right now, but there is room for yours. 833-288-3986. Do you have a special occasion coming up in your life very soon? You may want to visit EWTNRC.com. Click on the Final Clearance tab to find an amazing idea or two for gifts to give year-round. One of those many outstanding items is the Our Lady of Fatima round metal pendant. It's made of solid sterling silver, die-struck, hand-polished, depicting the children of Fatima kneeling in prayer before Holy Mother Mary. This is 1 inch by 1 inch. It comes with an 18-inch stainless steel curved chain. The necklace arrives in a deluxe velvet gift box. How about that? It is made in the USA. Do check it out at EWTNRC.com. Again, click on the Final Clearance tab. If you're a little stingy with the dollar like I am, like my wife is, that is a good tab to know about. So do check it out, EWTNRC.com. We're going to go back to the phones in just a moment. That phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Interesting question here from Sharon in Indianola, Iowa, listening on the great Iowa Catholic Radio. Sharon says, why did Jesus keep the wounds he did in his resurrected body? Why some and not all?
Well, I don't know that we know for sure that he didn't keep more of his wounds, but he makes a point of demonstrating his hands and his side.
Right.
That doesn't mean he didn't have others. And so it's impossible for me to answer the question because I don't actually know that to be the case. But, I mean, obviously he kept his wounds as badges, if you will, of his passion, which is, his glory and our salvation.
Yeah. And we do appreciate that. Thanks so much for your call. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning with Lou in St. Louis, that is, listening on the Great Covenant Network. Hello, Lou. Happy Friday. What's on your mind today, sir?
Oh, happy Friday. Blessed Easter season. Thanks for speaking with me again. I'd like to just talk about Pope Francis and the other popes in our lifetime. Pope Francis, a lot of people considered him left-leaning, and some of the other popes, like Benedict XVI and some of the other ones in our lifetime, were considered maybe right-leaning. But I've heard Dr. Anders say the Pope is his guy, and I believe that all the popes in our lifetimes have been his guys, and they're my guys too. So I just wonder what he would say about Pope Francis and maybe some of the other popes in our lifetime.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So first of all, I think that to try to pigeonhole the modern papacy in the left-right dynamics of American politics is very artificial, and it reduces them in ways that are ultimately distorting.
Kind of a force fit.
Yeah, and so the secular media was really keen, for example, to depict Benedict XVI as a kind of reactionary conservative. And I almost think you can't possibly have read anything the man ever wrote to take that point of view, right? I mean, like he was not an uncritical proponent of, say, free market capitalism. He preferred democratic socialism according to the European model, both as an economic and political sort of orientation. A lot of his specific interventions in areas of questions related to social justice would, from an American point of view, would seem more left-leaning than right-leaning. And within the theological domain, if you've read Benedict, you know that he was oftentimes sort of deeply accommodating to many of the insights and perspectives of modernity. And the way I interpret Benedict personally is that kind of sort of what I would think of sort of the radical left within the Catholic theological tradition, kind of a dissenting leftism would take the view that, the tradition is inadequate to meet the challenges of modernity. And a sort of radical right-leaning position within Catholic theology would be like, well, poo on modernity. We're going to toss it out the window and stick with unbroken tradition. And Benedict, to me, seemed to take another point of view entirely, which was to say, I think there is validity in the insights and criticisms of modernity, and yet I think that the Catholic tradition is adequate to answer those challenges, and we can come to a theological formulation that integrates the best of the modern perspective on the world with the depths of the riches of Catholic tradition. And so much of his pontificate, think about his Wednesday audiences where he just systematically went through the tradition and highlighted key figures from the apostles to the doctors of the church to great medieval theologians and saints. And it was just his effort to say, look, let's look at these brilliant and holy men and women throughout the centuries and what they can bring to the table to help us in our Catholic life. But he didn't shy away from, higher criticism or evolutionism. And he certainly wasn't he wasn't some sort of American neocon. I just think those characterizations are unhelpful, and I think it's very hard to put him in a box. Now, he did things in the liturgical sphere, like an expanded role for the Latin Mass and that sort of thing that are often viewed as conservative positions, but he himself was pretty clear about his motive for that. It was to try to bring disparate parties to the table and get factions within the church to be reconciled. So it wasn't because he had some sort of ideological axe to grind. It was a pragmatic decision on his part to try to enrich the Novus Ordo and the traditional liturgy and to reconcile differences in the church. So, he's a complex figure, and I think rather difficult to pigeonhole. John Paul II. It's funny, John Paul II, because many people view John Paul II as a sort of deeply conservative pope, particularly on issues of human sexuality and things of that nature, the theology of the body. And yet he was also very controversial in his own day, and he took stances, say, with respect to world religions that kind of stuck in the craw of a lot of more conservative Catholics. Also, he's just kind of a difficult person to pigeonhole in his perspective on Christian personalism and phenomenology and so forth. Obviously, that was not typical for papal theology. That he brought new perspectives to the table. He saw himself very much as the Pope of the Second Vatican Council. And that's why he took the name that he did, John Paul II. But he echoed John Paul I, saying, "I'm going to complete the job that John the 23rd and Paul VI inaugurated with the Second Vatican Council." And the Catechism of the Catholic Church was very intentionally the Catechism of the Second Vatican Council. So again, I don't think you can really pigeonhole him as left and right in American categories. And his encyclical Solicitudo Rei Socialis was very helpful to me because he deals with that. And he says, look, trying to describe the church's moral catechesis as either left or right is a category error. error, because it's not left and it's not right. It's not to be reduced to the level of ideology at all, right? And Pope Francis, whatever his political leanings, was a trenchant critic of ideology and ideological thinking as such, right? Now, clearly he tilted what I guess in positions that people would consider to be left by his sort of kind of open and generous stance towards groups in the church that would be regarded maybe as those are sort of leftist issues. But what the media often downplayed about Francis was how he would come out vociferously in defense of things like traditional marriage between a man and a woman. Yep. His attacks on gender ideology, his frequent invocations of the devil. I mean, again, it's kind of hard to pigeonhole the guy. And, commentators often want to reduce the church or the popes to their own political or ideological agenda. And I just think that's reductive and unhelpful. I think you have to let these men speak for themselves and hear what they have to say on their own terms. I personally, I love all these men. I have I've benefited tremendously from reading their works and pondering their pastoral advice. They're all men. They're all human beings. They all have failings and shortcomings. Don't think any of them was perfect. Even the ones that are canonized saints weren't perfect. When they had issues in their pontificates where we look back and go, oh, man, I can't believe he missed that. There were scandals that took place under John Paul II that, his oversight was just kind of amazing. That somebody of his brilliance didn't see what was going on, what people were doing in the kitchen in his own, backyard. But I love them all. I think they all have something valuable to show us. I think, in Francis, he sounded a very consistent note from start to finish through his entire pontificate, and that was that our attachment to the gospel of Christ must sensitize us to the dignity of the marginalized, the poor, the migrant, the other. Right, those on the peripheries, and sometimes the peripheries could be conceived of in political terms. Other times it would be conceived of as just the guy in the parish or the lady in the parish who can't receive compassion in the confessional, right? Sure. And he always had a heart for who's falling through the cracks of the church's ministry. How are we failing to reach them? And a deep willingness to challenge the church's traditional ways of doing things, habits and customs that, not dogmas, right, but just habits, where we might be working to defend or prop up the status quo rather than challenging the status quo in the interest of the apostolate and reaching souls. And anybody who's worked in Catholic ministry, as I have, you know exactly what he's talking about. You've seen when attitudes of rigidity or turf guarding or institutionalism or clericalism or careerism get in the way of apostolate and human dignity, and Francis was a staunch and trenchant critic of that mindset, of that ethos, and it was very unfortunate that had to take a political hue, and therefore battle lines got drawn within the church. And I've had a lot of people reach out to me, friends of mine that are not Catholic, and sort of commiserate with me, express their condolences on the death of the Pope, and it's a kind of a tragedy and an evil whenever a soul dies, because we're destined for immortality. But, my perspective on Francis is, the man was 88. He didn't live a short life, right? He wasn't in good health. He nearly died a month ago, right? And I sort of feel like, he had accomplished what he was going to accomplish in his pontificate, right? The major accomplishments, the themes that he struck early on, and positions on Francis had kind of ossified, and I don't know that another 10 years he would have had 10 more years of productivity, right? So I sort of feel like he died at an opportune moment in his papacy, and it's time to turn the page on the church, and we'll pray the Holy Spirit will give us the Pope we need, for the next 10 to 20 years or however long he might serve. And I have absolutely no idea who that's going to be. Nobody else does, but personally, I kind of feel like we need someone who can speak to the world stage and be above that political fray, because the world is so fractured right now between right and left and east and west and rich and poor, and we need someone who can speak to all of those groups and hopefully be an advocate for peace.
Lou, thanks so much for your call today from St. Louis. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. Looks like one line, possibly two lines open right now, 833-288-EWTN. 288-3986. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Alicia in Texas, listening on the Great Guadalupe Radio. Alicia, what's on your mind today?
Yes. I had a question. I'm a Catholic, and I've always heard other religions say that why do us Catholics still have Jesus on the cross if Jesus was brought down from the cross?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So this question has an interesting history within Protestantism. Protestants usually make this charge against Catholics. And what I mean by that is that Protestants don't know, historically, why they object to the corpus on the cross. And the charge, well, don't you know that Jesus is resurrected? It's just patently absurd on its face. Because of course we know Jesus was resurrected, right? Of course we do. I mean, the most solemn feast in the church's calendar is Easter, right?
Yeah.
And every Protestant, well, not every Protestant, but many Protestants running around today will have a manger scene at Christmas time. Don't they know that Jesus is not a baby anymore? I mean, of course they know he's not a baby anymore, but they still have baby Jesus in the manger and a bunch of donkeys around him, and they do that, and they have Christmas pageants and plays, and the kids get up and dress like shepherds and all the rest of it, right? Of course they know that Jesus is not still in the manger in Bethlehem. It's just, I mean, it's an absurd objection. And the reason they say that is that they've forgotten the reason that their own forefathers objected to the corpus on the cross. And it has nothing to do with Catholics being ignorant of the resurrection. Early Protestants were not so silly. Luther never said Catholics forgot that Jesus was resurrected. Calvin never said Catholics forgot that Jesus resurrected. They had another objection. Luther, by the way, did not object to the corpus. Lutheran churches are filled with statuary, right? But the Calvinists did. The Calvinists objected. The reason they objected to the corpus on the cross was that their interpretation of the second commandment, or their numbering of the commandments, right, so that they believed the second one was a prohibition on the making of any image. And so for the Calvinist tradition, to have any religious imagery or artwork, they considered to be an act of idolatry. And so it wasn't the belief that Catholics are ignorant of the resurrection. It was that Catholics are violating what they took to be the second commandment by making religious artwork. Now, the reason you don't hear that from Protestants anymore is they've now filled their churches with religious artwork. I mean, like when I was a Presbyterian kid growing up, we had, I went to Sunday school every single Sunday. And the standard pedagogical tool for Sunday school when you're 5 years old in the Presbyterian church in the 1970s was the flannel graph.
Oh, my.
I don't think anybody has flannel graphs anymore.
I hope
but it
not.
was the flannel graph. And every flannel graph had a visible representation of Jesus and usually a bunch of sheep, right?
Yeah.
And it was religious artwork, and we used it for educational purposes. And you find it all the way, shot through evangelicalism. So they've become comfortable with religious artwork, but they just know that they're supposed to object to Catholics, so they've come up with a new justification for that argument.
Alicia, thanks so much for your call. In a moment, Stephen in South Carolina. Lines are open for you as well here on Call to Communion.
Father Benedict Groeschel on Life.
My regret is that Catholics don't stand together against abortion. On Judgment Day, we will have to face the fact that the death of millions of children legally in this country has happened because Christians did not stand together.
EWTN, preserving human dignity in a throwaway culture.
Hi, this is Father Mike Schmitz.
This is Owen Jensen from EWTN News Nightly.
This is Bishop Robert Barron.
This is Ron Meyer from Blessed to Play.
The most trusted Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
Hello, I'm Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director for EWTN News and a faithful reader and subscriber to the National Catholic Register. The Register has in its pages everything about the world around us. Sections on, of course, the Church, on church teaching, politics, culture. The National Catholic Register is an absolutely vital source in your own personal formation as a Catholic. I read it every day. It's a major part of my educational life, of my professional life, my personal life, and my faith life.
Subscribe to the Register today and get 1 year for the greatly discounted price of just $32.50. That's 26 issues delivered to your home, office, or parish. Simply order online at ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code radio for your discount. The National Catholic Register. Read faithfully.
On the next More to Life, walking on eggshells.
Tired of tiptoeing around certain folks? We're going to help you handle difficult people.
That's on the next More to Life. Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, glad you're with us for the Friday edition of Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for David, 833-288-3986. Hey, if you're listening to us in Kansas today, your EWTN radio station needs to hear from you next week. That would be the great Divine Mercy Radio, airing their spring carathon starting on Tuesday. So if you're listening in Hayes or Colby or Great Bend or anywhere, please support your Catholic radio station. That is a wonderful Catholic radio apostolate, been with us for many, many years. We're very glad to be giving them a little shout out. Check them out, help them out next Tuesday. I think that's for the majority of the week. All right, back to the phones now at 833-288-EWTN. Here is Stephen, a first-time caller from South Carolina, listening on Sirius XM, channel 130. Hello, Stephen. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hi, good afternoon.
Howdy.
I just heard your show today for the first time and wondered if you could expound a little bit more regarding the text that you answered. And the subject was whether or not there were, I don't know if the right term, heretics, I might not remember the question correctly, or sects that grew out of the beginnings of the church and might conflict with Catholicism. Do you remember that text?
Yes, I do. So someone had asked the question, why were there heresies in antiquity that are no longer current, whereas Protestantism continues to exist to perdure with vigor?
Yeah.
And so the question, this was not my interpretation, this is the questioner's interpretation, was to assimilate Protestantism to that ancient category of heresy, right? And I should have corrected that, but I didn't. I just took the question as stated and let the questioner's point of view govern my answer, and I apologize because I think that you may have mentioned to the call screener, that suggested that I viewed Protestantism as a heresy. And I want to clarify that point because the Catholic Church does not call Protestants heretics.
No.
That's not our usage, okay? And so I want you to get that idea out of your head, right? And in fact, the stance of the Catholic Church towards Protestants, they are what we call separated brethren. Separated, like we're not in full communion with them.
Right.
And it's not only a discipline or anything. I mean, we do have doctrinal differences, and we think those differences matter, but we don't characterize those differences as heresies. And there's a technical reason for that within Catholic theology, and it's this, that technically speaking, the canonical crime of heresy is when a person obstinately rejects a dogma of the faith. They know what the church teaches, right? They understand the church's authority and the basis for the doctrine, and they obstinately object to it, and they reject it. And as a canonical crime, it's something that only a Catholic can do. Right? So the idea of a non-Catholic committing the crime of heresy doesn't make any sense. It's sort of like saying, is someone guilty of breaking the speed limit in Alabama if they do 120 miles an hour on the Autobahn in Germany? Well, of course not.
No.
Right? Like, it's a different jurisdiction.
Sure.
Right? So the law applies when you're on the road in Alabama. You can drive 120 on the Autobahn and, the Alabama, Highway Patrol is not going to come after you, right? I don't know about the German people, but, it's not going to happen, right?
Okay.
And so, if a Protestant, let's say a oneness Pentecostal, denies the dogma of the Trinity,
yeah,
he has some, definitely there's a point of continuity there with an ancient heresy, namely, Arianism. But we wouldn't necessarily call him a heretic in the same sense because he's not a Catholic who's obstinately rejecting a dogma, right?
All right.
If a Protestant doesn't believe the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, well, if I, as a Catholic, denied the dogma of transubstantiation, I'd be a heretic. I'd commit the canonical crime of heresy.
Sure.
But, before I was Catholic, when I was raised a Protestant, I didn't deny that doctrine obstinately. I didn't recognize it as a dogma. Right. I didn't understand the authority of the church. So I would be in error, but not heretical. Does that make sense?
Does that make sense to you?
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate your call from South Carolina. Call to communion here on EWTN. Still time for your call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Neenan is listening in Long Island, on Long Island if you prefer, on Sirius XM, channel 130. Neenan, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hi. Yes. So I wanted to know, historically and currently, why hasn't an American cardinal been a strong contender for Pope?
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the question. So until John Paul II, every pope for many centuries had been Italian. And I can't remember the last time we had a non-Italian pope, but it would have been in the High Middle Ages, going back like to the Avignon papacy. So we had like exclusively Italian popes for many, many centuries. John Paul was to really break the mold there, and so we've only had 3 non-Italian popes in, heaven knows how many centuries.
Yeah.
So I think you have to ask, like, why was John Paul elected? Why was Benedict elected? Why was Francis elected? Those specific men. And there were Americans in the conclave for those particular papal elections, but, none of them had the stature or, the gravitas that they were looking for at that time. Now, I've never attended a papal conclave.
Glad to hear that.
I don't know. I mean, I expect I never will. Okay. But the majority of the cardinals are not Americans, by a long shot. Right?
Yeah.
The Americans are a very small minority.
Yeah.
And even though the papal conclave as an institution was invented as a way of trying to insulate the process of choosing a pope from the larger political culture, cardinals are human beings, and therefore they're not insulated from the larger political culture.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
And I think personally, whatever his theology or pastoral skill, the decision to choose an American pope would open an enormous political can of worms. I don't care what position he takes on any issue. Just the bare fact of his being an American would be a very contentious thing. And it would invite all kinds of conspiracies and all kinds of...
Gee, David, why do you say that?
Well, because America is the 800-pound gorilla on the world stage, and has exerted so much influence, and American politics are often viewed rather dimly in the rest of the world, and more so in the last 30 years than probably in the previous 200 years, and I think the fear that the church had somehow capitulated to Americanism or something like that would be very pervasive. If you go to Rome and you walk down the street in Rome today, you just see a ton of Americans in clerics. You just see piles of them. I mean, and this is I think there's just an economic reality here that the American church is wealthy comparatively to the rest of the church in the rest of the world. And just because of the numbers and the economics, it exerts a tremendous influence in the background on world Catholicism. Educationally, financially, and otherwise. And like just counting the number of American clerics walking around in Rome relative to the number of Catholics that are in the world, it's a disproportionately large number. I mean, I read an article in a Catholic newspaper, 10 years ago, speculating, kind of tongue-in-cheek on whether or not the language of the church should be English, because there were just so many English speakers running around in the Vatican.
Wow.
And I mean, that's obviously it's not going to be, right? And I just think that lends a dynamic that would just invite headache and controversy and difficulty if an American Pope were ever named. I mean, so I just think it's just tremendously unlikely to happen. And I am going off about something about which I have absolutely no familiarity and do not know what I'm talking about, right? Because there are so many people better qualified to answer that question than me.
There's so much papal watching going on in my lifetime. I mean, John Paul II came out of nowhere. Benedict came out of nowhere. Francis came out of nowhere.
Benedict wasn't quite as out of nowhere.
Well, maybe not.
Right? I mean, because he was probably the best known cardinal throughout the world.
Sure, no, you're right.
He gave that tremendous speech, and his whole, dictatorship, the dictatorship of relativism business, all that really caught the imagination of the cardinal electors, and his stature as the prefect for the CDF for all those years under John Paul. I mean, he was definitely. I mean, it looks to me like John Paul was setting him up to be the successor, right?
It's fascinating to think about things like this, although, as you say, we have no idea.
I have no idea.
Yeah. So there you go. Nina, thank you so much for your call from Long Island. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Quick reminder of what we've got coming up, and that, of course, the solemn funeral mass for His Holiness Pope Francis. That'll be live for you tomorrow morning, 3 a.m. Eastern, on EWTN television and radio. We will encore it, the Mass, at 10 a.m. Eastern on EWTN television and radio, and then again at 6 p.m. on EWTN Radio Extra. So you've got multiple chances to check that out, be at one with the Holy Church. All right, let's go to Barb now, a first-time caller in Lancaster, Ohio, listening on the Blowtorch St. Gabriel Radio. Hey, Barb, what's on your mind today?
Hi. Wondering, I've been talked to other people that say that Protestants have said that during the Catholic Mass that Catholics are crucifying Jesus over again.
Yep.
And I just wondered how to respond to that, or
Yep.
why do they say that?
Yep. So this is an extremely old Protestant criticism of Catholicism. Goes back to Martin Luther.
Wow.
And so it's deeply embedded. See, one thing about Protestantism is that their doctrinal statements, unlike our doctrinal statements, their doctrinal statements include a specific repudiation of Catholicism, of the papacy, and of the Mass. Right? So like when we say, what does it mean to be a Catholic? We recite the Nicene Creed. I believe in God. I believe in Christ. I believe in the Holy Spirit. They say all that, and then they say, and we disbelieve in the Pope, and we disbelieve in transubstantiation, and we disbelieve in the sacrifice of the Mass. They specifically single out Catholic doctrines for repudiation as part of their essential identity, right? So these tropes about what Catholicism is are woven into the fabric of Protestant self-understanding. And so, when a Protestant has a dogmatic commitment to believing that Catholics make a particular error, telling him, we don't actually do that error, like it doesn't connect. Like they've been told from childhood, this is what Catholics are, right? And this is one of those tropes that it's been with the Protestant tradition for 500 years. So here's the basis of that. The Catholic Church teaches that the Mass is a true sacrifice. It is a true sacrifice, and it means it in a very realistic way. So it's not just that the death of Christ on Calvary is somehow made mystically present to us. Right? And there are Catholics who mistakenly think that's what the Church says, but that's not what the Church says. The Church says each individual Mass is a distinct oblation which has its own sacrificial character, which is why you could ask your priest to say Mass on Monday for one intention and Mass on Tuesday for another intention, right? Because they're distinct sacrificial acts. They each have its own unique propitiatory value, right? So we clearly believe the Mass is a sacrifice, okay? And liturgically, if you go back to the 16th century, that doctrine was expressed in gesture in ways that are unfamiliar to us today. So if you've ever been to, before it burned down, Notre Dame de Paris, for example, great cathedrals of medieval Europe, you will notice that they had not just one altar, but they had a bunch of altars. They'd have the main altar and a bunch of side altars. And you have to put yourself in the mindset, go back, 800 years, and imagine going to the cathedral on a weekday, on a work day, and seeing all those altars occupied. like a priest saying Mass at every one of them.
Wow.
And maybe lay people lined up behind an altar with a Mass stipend ready to go to ask, the next priest in line to say a Mass for their particular intention, right? And so the kind of commercialization, or the sense that it was being commercialized, Mass for my intention, pay a Mass stipend, get your ritual and then head out the door. Like that kind of relationship to the Mass, came in for deep criticism by the Protestant reformers. And they said, look, this is like a kind of, they would consider it kind of a superstitious, base, sacrificial system on the order of the Old Testament cult, right? And we just object to that whole way of conceptualizing our relationship to Jesus. And so they really, really attacked the idea that the Mass was a sacrifice. And one of the ways they did that was to point to the book of Hebrews, that said that the death of Christ was once for all and obviated any future sacrifices, right? And that particularly in the mold of the Levitical sacrifice, that the cult in the Temple of Jerusalem was over, that the blood of goats and bulls was no longer necessary, and that Christ was the eternal high priest who made his priesthood and his sacrifice ever present to God as he intercedes for the faithful. You don't need to approach God ever again on the model of the Old Testament priesthood and the Levitical sacrificial system. And look over here, look at these Catholics doing just that. It's just, they would say, well, Catholics are just absurd for doing that, all right? And so we reject the whole thing. So that's kind of where the objection came from, right? Now, the Catholic Church could not eliminate the doctrine that the Mass is a sacrifice because Scripture teaches it. St. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians, and 2,000 years of unbroken Catholic tradition and liturgical practice confirm it, right? So it is a dogma of the faith that the Mass is a sacrifice. But what they could do is they could further develop and explicate what that means. Now, it was perfectly well explicated in the scholastic theologians, but maybe the Reformers didn't bother to read them carefully enough. But they further explicated it at the Council of Trent and subsequent theology as well. And so let me tell you why the objection is wrong, why it's misconceived, okay? First of all, it is true that the Mass is a sacrifice, but in what manner is it a sacrifice? And no less a luminary than Thomas Aquinas answers the question this way. He says the Mass is a sacrifice in the same way that we say a picture of Cicero is Cicero. You see a picture hanging on the wall of Cicero and go, hey, that's Cicero. Well, is it really Cicero? Well, it's his picture. It's his image. but the expression is still valid.
Sure,
right? That's
sure.
Right? And he says that the Mass is a picture of what happened at Calvary. That's why we call it the memorial of Christ's death and resurrection. It presents in this figurative way the separation of Christ's body and blood by the double consecration of the elements. All right? So it's a picture of what happened at Calvary. We do not think that Christ is immolated again. He's not killed on the altar of the Mass. In fact, and this is where Trent was very clear, it's emphatic that the sacrifice of the Mass is unbloody, meaning there is no sacrificial victim who is immolated, except in a symbolic manner. Now, you hear me say symbol, and you get all nervous and think I'm denying the doctrine of the real presence. I'm not. I'm not denying the doctrine of the real presence. I'm denying the doctrine that the Mass kills Jesus. That the death of Christ is symbolically presented in the Mass. But it comes with this added benefit, that the victim who was actually immolated in Calvary 2,000 years ago is also present in this memorial offering through transubstantiation. And so when the priest comes and says, we offer you, this spotless victim.
Yes.
He's really there. He's really there through transubstantiation, but in an unbloody manner. In an unbloody manner. And then here's the kicker. Pope Pius XII made this point very clearly in his encyclical on the liturgy, Mediator Dei. He says, in the Mass, there are really two sacrifices. There's this ritual presentation, this memorialization of what happened at Calvary. That's the ritual sacrifice. But then, where the meat of the spiritual work gets done, he says, there's the interior sacrifice, as we offer ourselves along with him. And between the two, the Pope writes, it is the interior that is the more efficacious. This is the Pope talking here, not Anders.
Yeah.
Right? I'm quoting Mediator Dei, right? And he's just echoing the biblical teaching when Paul says in Romans 12, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. This is your spiritual act of worship. So the claim that the death of Christ eliminates all sacrifice is false. It's false, manifestly false, because Paul commands us to sacrifice. What? Ourselves. You must sacrifice. It's endemic to the nature of the Christian life. It's not eliminated. What is eliminated is the Old Testament sacrificial cult. That's gone forever. Christians do not need to offer goats and bulls on an altar in Jerusalem. What we do is we memorialize what happened at Calvary. We present the living body of Christ through transubstantiation on the altar. And then we join ourselves to that offering, this gift of self, right, that is our spiritual act of worship. And thus, the Mass becomes the occasion for us to grow ever more like Christ in his eternal act of self-offering. So it is, if you approach it with faith and charity, the right disposition, the Mass is incredibly sanctifying. Pius XII calls it the most efficacious means of attaining sanctity, not because the ritual magically transforms you. We reject a magical interpretation of the sacraments, but because it presents to us what Christ did and says, do that. Model your own life after what is shown to you on the altar. That's why St. Augustine could write to the church and say, Christian, become what you see. I love that. Yeah. Become what you see, right? That's the way you actualize the power of the Mass in your life, is to become what you see. What's shown to us ritually on the altar, make that your own. Become that in your interior life, with the confidence that as you come forward to that table of that altar of sacrifice, you will receive the true and real body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus, offered eternally for our salvation.
Barb, thank you so much for your call today. We hope that is helpful for you. Glad you're listening to us in Lancaster, Ohio. All right, here's a question now from Frank watching us on YouTube. Get a little bit in the weeds on this one. Does the 1999 Joint Declaration on Justification mean that the Catholic Church and, say, Lutherans are closer than we think to agreeing on our justification?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So I can't tell you the number of commentators I have heard over the years, even Catholic commentators, even Catholic informed commentators who should know better, and I could name them, but I won't, all right, who have said publicly things like, well, due to the 1999 Joint Declaration, we see that Catholics and Lutherans no longer disagree on justification. We're all on one big happy justification family now. Ha ha ha. We can dispense with that debate all together. That is not what the Joint Declaration says. You hadn't read the document, and you don't know the doctrine if you think that's what it says. It doesn't say that, right? The point of the Joint Declaration is, what are all the things we agree on? Well, there's a lot of things we agree on.
Sure.
There you go. That's the whole point. Just name the things we agree on. What it doesn't do is name all the places where we continue to disagree and point out that those are substantive, real, and that they matter. All right? Now, the truth of the matter is at the heart of the issue on justification, Catholics and Protestants continue to disagree, and to disagree substantively. And here's the key difference that the Joint Declaration does not go into. Is justification an infusion of Christ's righteousness, whereby we are transformed into his likeness and image and thereby enabled to merit salvation? That's the Catholic position. Or is it the imputation of Christ's righteousness, namely God counting Jesus' righteousness to our account as if it were our own, where we are considered by God to be righteous, even though we remain objectively sinful? Luther's doctrine of simul justus et peccator, or simultaneously just and sinful, as the Protestants hold. That distinction is essential and is unaddressed by the Joint Declaration. And it is the primary reason I became a Catholic. So when I was in seminary, 1995, the evangelicals and Catholics together ecumenical statement came out. And my Protestant seminary professors were incensed. They thought it was a terrible document because, like the Joint Declaration, all it did was point out areas of commonality. And they said, hey, this is going to lead Protestants to think that Catholics are okay, but we know Catholics are still heretics because they don't affirm imputation. Like, all the work happens at imputation. Imputation is the line in the sand. That's where you have to draw the line. If you don't believe imputation, then you're out of redemption. That's it. That's the difference between Protestants and Catholics. And I believed that as a Protestant. So then I got to graduate school. I started really, really deeply studying justification and church history. And I said, yeah, they're right. My Protestant seminary professors were right. Imputation is the line in the sand. That is the big difference between Protestants and Catholics on the doctrine of salvation. And you know what? The Catholics are right. I'd better become a Catholic.
Wow.
So I can thank my Protestant seminary professors for putting the idea in my mind that where you come down on that issue determines whether you're Protestant or Catholic. And they did not elide the distinction. And because of them, because of my Protestant professors, I became a Catholic. Because I said, you're right. That is the line in the sand. Problem is, the Catholics got it right.
And so it was by design that only the points of commonality were brought up.
That's what you do in ecumenism. Ecumenism is not about picking a fight. It's about pointing out the areas of commonality, show all the things we have in common, right? I mean, that's good. That's fine. That's fine, right? But if you think that it says we don't have any differences, you're just misreading the document and its purpose.
There you go. Frank, thanks so much for watching us today on YouTube. Glad we could get that question in. Dr. David Anders, have a great weekend.
Thanks, Tom.
One more quick reminder here before we close things out, and that is because we will be having the broadcast of the funeral of Pope Francis. That's going to be at 3 a.m. Eastern on EWTN radio and television, also with an encore at 10 a.m. Eastern. Not everybody's going to be up at 3 in the morning or, 2 or 1 in the morning, depending on your time zone, but you can probably tune in to that encore. We'll bring it to you in its entirety at 10 a.m. Eastern on EWTN radio. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. You have a great weekend. We'll see you next time here on Call to Communion. Have a great one and God bless.
Hi, this is Father Mike.